The basement archives of St. Dominic's Cathedral in Baltimore hold a leather-bound journal that church officials discovered in 1893, buried beneath floorboards during renovation work. The journal belonged to Father Vincent Callahan, confessor to the Sisters of Divine Mercy Convent from 1761 to 1767. Its pages, yellowed and water-stained, contain an entry dated November 3, 1764, written in handwriting so agitated that entire sentences bleed into illegibility. The words that remain legible describe something Father Callahan called the most disturbing confession of his 32 years in the priesthood. Sister Bridget O'Malley, 55 years old, Mother Superior of the convent, a woman whose reputation for holiness had drawn pilgrims from 3 colonies, stood before him in the confessional and spoke words that would shatter everything he thought he knew about faith, sin, and the boundaries between them. She was pregnant, 4 months along, carrying the child of an 18-year-old enslaved man named Samuel, who worked in the convent's gardens. And when Father Callahan asked her how this could have happened, how a woman who'd devoted 37 years to God could commit such a grievous sin, Sister Bridget looked him directly in the eyes and said something that haunted him until his death. "This is not sin, Father. This is God's greatest miracle, and I will prove it to the world. What happened in that Maryland convent didn't just expose one woman's fall from grace. It revealed a web of secrets, manipulation, and desperate faith that reached from the poorest enslaved quarters to the Archbishop's palace in Philadelphia. Tonight, we're opening that sealed journal and telling the story that the Catholic Church spent decades trying to erase." The year 1764 marked a peculiar moment in colonial Maryland's history. The colony had been founded by Catholics seeking refuge from English persecution, but by the 1760s, Protestant settlers outnumbered Catholics 3-1, and anti-Catholic sentiment ran high. The Sisters of Divine Mercy Convent existed in this hostile environment, like a fortress of the old faith, its stone walls and iron gates separating 23 nuns from a world that increasingly viewed them with suspicion. The convent occupied 12 acres on the outskirts of Baltimore, far enough from the city center to maintain isolation, close enough to serve the Catholic families who still clung to their faith despite mounting pressure to convert. The main building, constructed in 1739, rose 3 stories high, its gray stone facade broken by narrow windows that looked more like defensive slits than sources of light. Behind the main structure stood the chapel, the dormitories, the kitchen house, and at the far edge of the property, barely visible from the main buildings, the quarters where 11 enslaved people lived and worked, maintaining the gardens, kitchens, and physical infrastructure that kept the convent functioning. Sister Bridget O'Malley had arrived from Ireland in 1727, a 17-year-old girl fleeing famine and hopelessness, seeking purpose in religious devotion. She'd taken her final vows in 1730 and had spent the next 34 years rising through the convent's hierarchy through sheer force of will and unshakable faith. By 1764, as Mother Superior, she controlled every aspect of convent life with precision that bordered on obsession. The other sisters whispered about her, not from malice, but from awe. Sister Bridget seemed to need no sleep, appeared in the chapel at all hours, prayed with an intensity that left her trembling and drenched in sweat, spoke with such certainty about God's will that questioning her felt like questioning divine authority itself. She was not a kind woman, not in any conventional sense. She believed that suffering purified the soul, that comfort bred weakness, that the path to God required constant discipline and denial. The younger nuns learned quickly that Sister Bridget's approval came only through absolute obedience and tireless devotion. She assigned the most difficult tasks, enforced the strictest fasting schedules, and showed no sympathy for illness or exhaustion. Yet, despite this harshness, or perhaps because of it, the convent thrived under her leadership. Wealthy Catholic families sent their daughters there for education. The sick came seeking the nuns' herbal medicines. The chapel drew worshippers from surrounding counties who believed that prayers offered in Sister Bridget's presence carried special power. Samuel had arrived at the convent in August 1762, purchased from an estate sale in Annapolis after the death of his previous owner, a tobacco merchant who'd taught him to read, write, and perform basic mathematics, skills that made him valuable but also dangerous. Enslaved people with education posed threats that illiterate field workers did not. They could forge passes, read newspapers, understand the legal documents that governed their bondage. Most owners avoided educated slaves entirely. But the convent needed someone capable of managing correspondence, maintaining financial records, and teaching basic literacy to the younger novices who arrived from poor families without formal schooling. Sister Bridget had personally selected Samuel at the auction, examining him with the same clinical detachment she applied to inspecting vegetables at the market. She asked him to read a passage from the Bible, write a sentence in clean script, and calculate the sum of 3 large numbers. He performed all 3 tasks flawlessly, his hands steady despite the humiliation of being evaluated like livestock. Sister Bridget paid £48, a considerable sum, and brought him back to the convent with explicit instructions. He would work in the library, transcribing texts and managing documents. He would assist Sister Margaret in teaching the youngest students their letters. He would maintain absolute silence about everything he saw or heard within the convent's walls. Any violation of these rules would result in immediate sale to the worst plantation owner Sister Bridget could find, and she assured him she knew several men whose cruelty was legendary. For 2 years, Samuel lived up to these expectations perfectly. He moved through the convent like morning mist, present but insubstantial, performing his duties with quiet efficiency. He slept in a small room above the stable, ate meals alone in the kitchen after the nuns had finished, and spoke only when directly addressed. The sisters grew accustomed to his presence in spaces normally forbidden to men: the library during morning hours, the classroom during afternoon lessons, the corridors when delivering messages between buildings. His youth and his obvious intelligence made him seem less threatening than the older men who worked the fields and never entered the main structures. Sister Bridget watched him constantly, though he didn't realize it initially. She'd positioned her desk in the administrative office to provide a clear view through the window into the library where Samuel worked. She could observe him for hours, watching how he handled the ancient texts, how carefully he formed each letter when copying manuscripts, how completely he lost himself in the act of reading. Something about his absorption troubled her deeply. Books and learning should serve God, should draw the mind toward divine contemplation. But Samuel read with a hunger that seemed almost carnal, as though knowledge itself provided pleasure separate from spiritual purpose. The shift in their relationship began on a February evening in 1764, 9 months before Father Callahan's disturbing confession. Samuel was working late in the library, transcribing a sermon collection by candlelight, when Sister Bridget entered unexpectedly. He immediately stood and lowered his eyes, the posture of deference he'd perfected. But she waved him back to his seat. "Continue your work," she said, moving to the shelves, running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes. "I'm merely retrieving something for my evening prayers." Samuel returned to his transcription, hyper-aware of her presence, the soft sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor, the rustle of her habit, the faint scent of the lavender soap the nuns made from their garden herbs. Sister Bridget pulled a volume from the upper shelf, a collection of mystical writings by medieval nuns, then paused before leaving. "Samuel," she said, her voice carrying a quality he'd never heard before, something almost gentle. "Do you understand what you copy? The words you transcribe, do they mean anything to you, or are they merely shapes you reproduce?" He looked up carefully, uncertain whether this was a test. "I understand some of it, Mother Superior. The language is often difficult, but I try to grasp the meaning." "And what do you think of Father Bernard's sermon on divine suffering, the one you've been copying this week?" The question hung in the air heavy with danger. Samuel understood that his answer could determine his fate. If he said he hadn't comprehended the theological arguments, she might decide he was unsuitable for intellectual work and send him to field labor. If he demonstrated too much understanding, too much engagement with religious ideas, she might see him as presumptuous, a slave overstepping his place. "Father Bernard writes that suffering brings us closer to Christ," Samuel said carefully. "That physical pain can purify the soul when borne with proper devotion. I think he's writing about something I'll never fully understand, Mother Superior. I've known suffering of a different kind, the suffering of bondage, but I don't think that's what he means." Sister Bridget studied him for a long moment, her gray eyes unreadable in the candlelight. "Perhaps not," she said finally. "Or perhaps all suffering serves God's purpose, even the suffering we inflict upon each other." "Even the suffering that seems most unjust." She left then, taking the book with her. Leaving Samuel alone with his transcription and a growing sense that something had changed. though he couldn't identify what or why. Over the following weeks, these evening encounters became routine. Sister Bridget would enter the library while Samuel worked, ostensibly to retrieve books but actually to ask him questions. What did he think of various theological concepts? How did the scripture passages he copied strike him? Did he believe in miracles? Had he ever experienced anything he couldn't explain through natural means? Samuel answered as honestly as he dared, navigating the treacherous space between appearing too ignorant and too educated. He didn't understand why she was engaging with him this way. Mother Superiors didn't have philosophical discussions with enslaved workers. They certainly didn't seek their opinions on matters of faith. But Sister Bridget seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts, and Samuel found himself looking forward to these strange conversations, even as they frightened him. The turning point came on a May evening, unusually warm for Maryland spring. Samuel was alone in the library, organizing correspondence, when Sister Bridget entered and closed the door behind her, something she'd never done before. The sound of the latch clicking into place sent ice through Samuel's veins. "I need to speak with you about something of grave importance," Sister Bridget said, her voice low and urgent. "What I'm about to tell you must remain absolutely confidential. Do you understand? Your life depends on your silence." Samuel's hands trembled as he set down the papers he'd been sorting. "Yes, Mother Superior, I understand." Sister Bridget moved to the window, looking out at the darkening gardens. When she spoke again, her words emerged slowly, as though each one caused her pain. "For 37 years, I have served God with every fiber of my being. I have denied myself every comfort, every pleasure, every human desire. I have fasted until my body weakened. I have prayed until my knees bled. I have done everything the church requires and more. And in return, I ask God for one thing. Only one thing, a sign, proof that my devotion mattered, that my suffering served some purpose beyond mere obedience to institutional rules. Do you know what God's silence feels like, Samuel? When you pray for decades and hear nothing? When you beg for one small confirmation that you've not wasted your entire life and the heavens remain empty?" Samuel didn't answer. He sensed that these weren't really questions directed at him, but rather thought Sister Bridget was speaking aloud. "Possibly for the first time. 3 months ago," she continued, still facing the window, "I had a dream so vivid that when I woke, I couldn't immediately distinguish it from waking reality. In the dream, an angel appeared in my cell and told me that God had heard my prayers, that I had been chosen for a great purpose, that I would bear witness to divine power in a way that would challenge everything the church claims to believe about miracles and faith. The angel told me I would conceive a child, a holy child, born from devotion rather than sin, and that this child would prove that God's power extends beyond the narrow understanding of corrupt institutions." She turned then, and Samuel saw tears streaming down her face, something he'd never witnessed in all the time he'd known her. "I am 55 years old. My courses stopped 7 years ago. I am barren by every natural measure. Yet the dream felt more real than this room, more certain than any scripture I've ever read. And Samuel, I believe God sent me that dream for a reason." Samuel's heart hammered so hard he thought it might break through his chest. He understood now where this conversation was leading, and the knowledge terrified him beyond anything he'd ever experienced. "Mother Superior," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "dreams can deceive. They can come from our own desires rather than from God. You should speak to Father Callahan about this, not to me." "I've tried speaking to Father Callahan," Sister Bridget said, her voice hardening. "I've tried speaking to the Archbishop. They tell me the same thing you just did, that I'm an old woman experiencing delusions, that I should accept my barrenness as God's will. But they're wrong. I know they're wrong because the dream has returned every night for 3 months. The same angel, the same message, the same absolute certainty. God is testing my faith, Samuel. He's asking whether I believe him capable of working miracles outside the church's approved channels." She moved closer, and Samuel forced himself not to retreat. "I've studied the scriptures extensively. I've read theological texts the church keeps locked away from ordinary believers. And I've learned something the bishops don't want acknowledged. Miracles require human participation. When God performed wonders in the Bible, he always used human vessels. Moses' staff, Elijah's mantle, Mary's womb. God doesn't work in pure abstraction. He works through flesh and blood, through people willing to surrender themselves to divine purpose." "Mother Superior, please," Samuel whispered, Don't ask what I think you're about to ask. I can't. We both know what would happen to me if anyone discovered. No one will discover anything, Sister Bridget interrupted, her voice taking on the commanding tone he'd learned to fear. Because this won't be sin. This will be a woman making herself available to God's will, and a young man choosing to participate in something sacred rather than something shameful. I'm not asking you to defile me, Samuel. I'm asking you to help me prove that God's power exceeds human limitations, that faith can overcome every biological impossibility. Samuel stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I can't be part of this. You know what they'll do to me. They won't ask questions. They won't listen to explanations. They'll hang me, or worse. Mother Superior, you're asking me to die for your certainty about a dream. Sister Bridget's expression shifted from pleading to something colder, more calculating. You're right to fear discovery through conventional means. That's why what I'm proposing isn't conventional at all. I've spent 6 months studying medical texts that the Church acquired from a French monastery, scientific writings about animal reproduction, about breeding livestock without natural mating. The French have been experimenting with artificial methods, transferring reproductive material from male to female without any physical contact between them. It's documented, Samuel. It works. Samuel felt the room spin around him. You're talking about applying livestock breeding techniques to human beings. I'm talking about using the knowledge God gave humans to achieve what appears miraculous, Sister Bridget corrected. Think about it logically. If I become pregnant without breaking my vow of chastity, without any man touching me, how is that different from the Virgin Mary's conception? The method may be scientific, but the result will be indistinguishable from divine intervention. A 55-year-old barren woman bearing a healthy child. The doctors will have no explanation. The Church will have no choice but to acknowledge God's hand in it. Or they'll burn us both, Samuel said flatly. They'll call it witchcraft or satanic influence, or any number of other things that end with our deaths. Sister Bridget moved to her desk and retrieved a leather folder, which she opened to reveal several documents covered in her precise handwriting. I've thought of everything, Samuel. Every possible outcome, every danger, every objection. If we're discovered before the pregnancy is confirmed, I'll claim you assaulted me, and your word will mean nothing against mine. You'll be executed, but I'll survive. If we're discovered after the pregnancy is confirmed, I'll claim exactly what I believe to be true, that this is divine intervention, and I'll have a living child as evidence. Medical impossibility transformed into reality. How can they deny that? They'll find a way, Samuel said. The powerful always find ways to explain away things that threaten their authority. Perhaps. But Samuel, what's your alternative? You'll remain enslaved for the rest of your life. You'll work in this library, copying other people's words, living in that tiny room above the stable, owning nothing, being nothing, until you're too old to be useful, and they sell you to someone who'll work you to death in a tobacco field. Is that the life you want? Samuel said nothing because they both knew the answer. Sister Bridget pressed her advantage. Help me with this, and I promise you something the law says I cannot give, but which God's will makes possible. When the child is born, when the miracle is confirmed and the Church is forced to acknowledge divine intervention, I will have authority they cannot question. And I will use that authority to grant you freedom. Legal, documented freedom. You'll be able to leave Maryland, start a new life, be your own man. That's what I'm offering, Samuel. Participation in a miracle and liberation from bondage. You can't promise that, Samuel said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Mother Superiors don't have the authority to free enslaved people without the Archbishop's approval. I'll have more than the Archbishop's approval, Sister Bridget said, her eyes blazing with absolute conviction. When I prove that God has chosen me for this purpose, every door will open. Every impossibility will become possible. The Church will grant me whatever I ask, because denying me will mean denying the miracle itself. They'll have no choice. Samuel looked at the documents she'd spread before him, pages covered with anatomical drawings, procedural instructions, theological arguments. She'd prepared for this conversation with the same meticulous attention to detail she applied to everything else. This wasn't impulse or madness. This was calculated, deliberate, and terrifying in its precision. How would it work? He asked finally, hating himself for asking but unable to stop. These procedures you've read about. What exactly would we have to do? Relief flooded Sister Bridget's face. The process is surprisingly simple. We'll use the herb garden storage cellar. It's underground, completely private, accessible only through a locked door to which I have the only key. You'll provide the necessary biological material in one room. I'll collect it in a sterilized glass vessel that I've acquired from a medical supplier in Philadelphia. In a separate chamber, I'll use a specially designed syringe to introduce the material into my body. We'll never be in the same space during the crucial moment. You'll never touch me. By any technical definition, my chastity remains intact. That's a theological game, Samuel said. A technicality. Everyone will know what really happened. Everyone will know that a 55-year-old woman who hasn't menstruated in 7 years became pregnant, Sister Bridget countered. That's not a technicality. That's a biological impossibility. Let them explain it however they wish. The result will be the same, a living child born from absolute barrenness. How is that not a miracle? Samuel walked to the window, looking out at the garden where he'd spent so many hours tending plants that would never belong to him, watching seasons change that measured a life going nowhere. Sister Bridget was offering him something he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine. Hope, freedom, the chance to be something other than property. If I agree, he said slowly, and if everything happens exactly as you're planning, and if the church somehow accepts your explanation and grants you authority, and if you keep your promise about my freedom, where would I go? I'm an educated black man in a slave colony. Free papers won't make me safe. They'll just make me a target of a different kind. I've thought of that too, Sister Bridget said. There are free black communities in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia has hundreds of freed people working as laborers, craftsmen, merchants. With your education and your skills, you could establish yourself there. Build a life that's actually yours. Samuel turned to face her, studying the woman who held his fate in her hands. She believed every word she was saying. That was perhaps the most terrifying thing about her. This wasn't cynical manipulation. This was absolute faith twisted into something unrecognizable. When would this happen? He asked. We start tomorrow night, Sister Bridget said immediately. My calculations show that I have a narrow window when conception might be possible. We'll attempt the procedure once every 3 days for as long as necessary. The medical texts suggest multiple attempts may be required. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical thing. He could refuse. He could walk away from this conversation and hope Sister Bridget found her senses. But he knew her well enough by now to understand that she wouldn't stop. If he refused, she'd find someone else, some other desperate man she could manipulate with promises and threats, and Samuel would remain exactly where he was, trapped in a life that wasn't really life at all. God help us both, he whispered. I'll do it. The herb garden's storage cellar had been built decades earlier to keep roots and dried plants cool during the summer months. Its thick stone walls and underground location maintained steady temperatures year-round, making it ideal for preserving medicinal supplies. The cellar consisted of 2 chambers connected by a narrow passage, both rooms small and windowless, lit only by whatever candles or lamps were brought down the steep stairs. No one used the cellar regularly anymore. The nuns had built a new storage facility closer to the kitchen house, leaving this older structure abandoned except for occasional visits to retrieve forgotten items. Sister Bridget had cleaned both chambers thoroughly, removing cobwebs and dust, arranging candles on shelves, and bringing down the materials she'd acquired over the previous months. Medical instruments purchased from suppliers who asked no questions, glass vessels sterilized with boiling water, clean linens, anatomical diagrams she'd copied from the French medical texts. She'd transformed the abandoned cellar into something between a laboratory and a chapel, a space where science and faith would merge into something entirely new. The first attempt took place on May 18, 1764, just after midnight when everyone else slept. Samuel descended the cellar stairs with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, carrying a single candle that cast wild shadows on the stone walls. Sister Bridget was already there, wearing not her habit but a simple white shift, her long gray hair unbound for the first time he'd ever seen. She looked both younger and older somehow, more human, but also more frightening. She explained the procedure again with clinical detachment, pointing to the 2 chambers, showing him the glass vessel he would use, describing exactly what she needed him to do. Samuel listened, feeling heat rise to his face despite the cellar's coolness. The entire situation was so bizarre, so far beyond any experience he'd ever imagined, that his mind struggled to process it as reality. I'll be in the far chamber, Sister Bridget said, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. You'll remain here. When you've completed your part, leave the vessel on that shelf and go directly back to your room. Don't wait. Don't speak to me. Simply leave and we'll never discuss what happened here. This is a medical procedure, Samuel. Nothing more, nothing less. Do you understand? Samuel nodded because he couldn't trust his voice. Sister Bridget took the candle she'd brought and moved into the connecting passage, disappearing from view. Samuel stood alone in the first chamber, staring at the glass vessel on the wooden table, and wondered what series of choices had brought him to this moment. How many small decisions, how many acts of survival, how many compromises with reality had built the path that led to this underground room where he would participate in something that might be miracle or madness or both. He completed the task Sister Bridget had assigned, placed the vessel where she'd instructed, and left the cellar without looking back. He climbed the stairs into the warm night air, crossed the garden to the stable, and lay awake until dawn, listening to his heart hammer against his ribs. They repeated the procedure 3 days later, then 3 days after that, each time following the same pattern. Silent descent into the cellar, clinical efficiency, separate chambers, no communication beyond the bare minimum necessary. Sister Bridget treated the whole enterprise with the same detached precision she applied to managing the convent's accounts. Samuel tried to think of it as just another task he'd been assigned, like transcribing manuscripts or teaching children their letters. But his mind wouldn't cooperate with that fiction. After the 4th attempt, Sister Bridget informed him they would pause for 3 weeks to allow time for conception to occur if it was going to. During those weeks, Samuel moved through his regular duties with mounting anxiety. Every time Sister Bridget entered a room where he worked, he braced for her to announce failure or success, but she said nothing. She treated him exactly as she always had, with distant courtesy and precise instructions. It was as though the cellar sessions had never happened, as though they'd both agreed to pretend normalcy until reality forced them to acknowledge otherwise. The summer of 1764 was brutal. Heat settled over Maryland like a thick blanket, making sleep impossible and turning every physical task into an ordeal. The convent's routine continued unchanged. Morning prayers at dawn, work assignments throughout the day, evening prayers at dusk. Samuel taught his students, managed the library, copied manuscripts, and tried not to think about what might be developing in Sister Bridget's body as a result of their secret procedures. In late July, Sister Anna, a young nun who managed the convent's laundry, noticed something unusual. Sister Bridget's monthly linens hadn't appeared for washing in 2 consecutive months. Sister Anna mentioned this casually to Sister Margaret, who taught alongside Samuel in the schoolroom, and Sister Margaret dismissed it immediately. Sister Bridget was 55 years old. Her courses had stopped years ago. Sister Anna must have confused the laundry schedule or misplaced some items. But Sister Anna was certain. She kept meticulous records, and Sister Bridget's linens were definitely absent. By August, other sisters began noticing changes. Sister Bridget's face looked fuller somehow. She'd always been gaunt, her ascetic lifestyle leaving her thin and angular, but now there was a softness to her features that hadn't been there before. She'd also become particular about certain foods, refusing meat at meals where she'd previously eaten whatever was served without complaint. She seemed tired, retiring to her cell earlier than usual and missing morning prayers for the first time in anyone's memory. Sister Margaret, concerned about her Mother Superior's health, finally asked Sister Bridget directly if she was feeling ill. Sister Bridget's response was calm and measured. She was fine, simply adjusting to the body's changes that came with age. She assured Sister Margaret that she was taking appropriate herbal remedies and that there was nothing to worry about. But Sister Margaret did worry. She'd known Sister Bridget for 18 years, and something about her behavior felt fundamentally different. The way she placed her hand on her stomach when she thought no one was watching. The way she stared into space during meals, a small smile playing at her lips. The way she moved through the convent with an air of secret knowledge, as though she possessed information no one else could access. On September 12th, Sister Margaret's concerns reached a breaking point. She'd entered the chapel early in the morning for private prayer and found Sister Bridget already there, kneeling before the altar with tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sorrow. Sister Bridget was weeping with joy, her hands clasped over her stomach, whispering words Sister Margaret couldn't fully hear, but which sounded like gratitude, like triumph. Sister Margaret approached quietly. "Mother Superior, are you well?" Sister Bridget turned, and her expression was radiant. "I'm more than well, Sister Margaret. I'm blessed. God has answered my prayers in a way I barely dared hope. I am with child. The words hung in the air between them, so impossible that Sister Margaret's mind simply refused to process them initially. Mother Superior, you must be mistaken. You're 55 years old. It's not possible. All things are possible with God, Sister Bridget said, her voice carrying absolute conviction. And I tell you truly, Sister Margaret, I am 4 months pregnant. I have all the signs. The ceased bleeding, the morning sickness, the changes to my body. I am carrying a child, and that child is proof of divine intervention. Sister Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. Mother Superior, please. If you're experiencing these symptoms, they could indicate illness. A tumor, perhaps, or some other condition that mimics pregnancy. We need to send for a physician immediately. I will see a physician when the time is right, Sister Bridget said calmly. But Sister Margaret, you must understand something. This is not illness. This is miracle. And when I reveal it to the world, everything will change. For me, for this convent, for everyone who's ever doubted that God still performs wonders in our modern age. Sister Margaret backed away slowly, her mind racing. She needed to tell someone, but who? Father Callahan, the Archbishop. If Sister Bridget was truly pregnant, the implications were catastrophic. If she wasn't, if this was delusion or illness manifesting as false belief, that was perhaps even worse. Mother Superiors who lost touch with reality couldn't continue leading communities. She left the chapel without responding, went directly to her cell and wrote an urgent letter to Father Callahan, who visited the convent twice weekly to hear confessions and celebrate Mass. The letter, preserved in the Baltimore Diocesan Archives, reads in part, Father, something is gravely wrong with Mother Superior. She claims to be pregnant, speaks of miracles and divine intervention, and shows no awareness of how impossible her claims are. I fear her mind has been affected by illness or perhaps by excessive fasting and prayer. Please come immediately. This cannot wait until your scheduled visit. Father Callahan received the letter that afternoon and arrived at the convent before sunset. He found Sister Bridget in her administrative office, calmly working through correspondence as though nothing unusual had occurred. When he asked to speak with her privately, she agreed immediately and dismissed Sister Margaret, who'd been hovering nearby with obvious concern. Sister Margaret tells me you've made a rather extraordinary claim. Father Callahan began carefully. She says you believe yourself to be pregnant. I don't believe, Father. I know, Sister Bridget replied. My body tells me what my faith already confirmed. God has chosen me to demonstrate his power to a world that has forgotten how to recognize miracles when they occur. Father Callahan, who'd been a priest for 32 years and thought he'd heard every variety of confession, delusion, and spiritual crisis possible, found himself genuinely shocked. Sister Bridget, you understand that pregnancy at your age, given your circumstances, would be medically impossible. Medically impossible. Exactly, Sister Bridget said, leaning forward with intensity. That's precisely the point, Father. When something medically impossible occurs, we call it a miracle. When a 55-year-old woman who hasn't menstruated in 7 years, who has never broken her vows of chastity, bears a healthy child, how can anyone deny God's direct intervention? Sister, Father Callahan said, his voice gentle but firm, I think you need to see a physician. These symptoms you're experiencing could have many natural explanations. Tumors can cause the body to produce hormones that mimic pregnancy. Certain illnesses can create similar effects. We must rule out medical conditions before drawing theological conclusions. I welcome examination by physicians, Sister Bridget said calmly. Let them confirm what I already know. But Father, I need you to understand something. I'm not delusional. I'm not ill. I am completely sound of mind and body. What's happening to me is real, and when the truth becomes undeniable, the Church will have to confront questions it has avoided for centuries. Can God work through scientific processes? Can miracles occur outside approved channels? Can a woman's faith be powerful enough to overcome biological limitations? Father Callahan felt ice settle in his stomach. Sister Bridget, has something happened that you need to confess? Has any impropriety occurred? Nothing improper has occurred, Sister Bridget said firmly. I have maintained my vows absolutely. No man has touched me. My chastity remains intact, and yet I am with child. Draw whatever conclusions you wish, Father, but those are the facts. Father Callahan left that meeting deeply shaken. He immediately contacted the Archbishop's office in Philadelphia, describing the situation and requesting urgent guidance. The response came within a week. Sister Bridget was to be examined by a panel of physicians immediately. If pregnancy was confirmed, a full investigation would be launched. If she was not pregnant, she was to be removed from her position as Mother Superior and placed under medical supervision until her mental state stabilized. 3. Doctors arrived at the convent on September 28, 1764. Dr. William Harrison from Baltimore, known for his expertise in women's health. Dr. Thomas Whitmore from Philadelphia, who'd studied medicine in Edinburgh and specialized in difficult diagnoses. Dr. Robert Chen, whose family had immigrated from China and who brought knowledge of medical traditions unfamiliar to most colonial physicians. All three were known for discretion in sensitive matters, and all three understood that their findings would have implications far beyond simple medical diagnosis. They examined Sister Bridget separately, each conducting his own assessment before conferring. The examination took place in the convent's medical room, with Sister Margaret present as chaperone. Sister Bridget submitted to the process with calm dignity, answering questions about her symptoms, her medical history, and her certainty about the pregnancy. When the three physicians met afterward to compare findings, their conclusions were unanimous and deeply troubling. Sister Bridget was approximately 5 months pregnant. The fetus appeared healthy and properly developed. All physical signs pointed to normal gestation. By every medical measure they possessed, this 55-year-old woman who claimed 7 years of amenorrhea was carrying a viable child. Dr. Harrison's report, preserved in the Philadelphia Diocesan Archives, states, "I have examined hundreds of pregnant women in my 20 years of practice. I know the signs, the changes to the body, the unmistakable indicators. Sister Bridget O'Malley is pregnant. I cannot explain how this is possible given her age and reported medical history, but the evidence is irrefutable. This presents not only a medical mystery, but a situation requiring immediate ecclesiastical attention." When Father Callahan received the physician's reports, he sat in his rectory office for nearly an hour, staring at the documents, before finally writing the confession that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The entry in his journal, dated October 3rd, describes his state of mind. "I have devoted my life to God's service, believing that faith and reason could coexist peacefully. But this situation challenges everything I thought I understood. If Sister Bridget is truly pregnant through some natural means, she has violated her vows and deceived us all. If she is pregnant through supernatural intervention, then God has chosen the most disturbing possible method to demonstrate his power. Either way, I fear what comes next." What came next would tear the convent apart and force everyone involved to confront the terrible space between miracle and manipulation, between divine will and human desperation. The Archbishop arrived from Philadelphia on October 7th, traveling in a covered carriage that reached the convent just before dawn. Archbishop Edmund Cartwright was 63 years old, a man who'd spent 4 decades navigating the treacherous waters of Catholic leadership in Protestant-dominated colonies. He'd survived accusations of disloyalty during the French and Indian War, maintained the Church's influence despite mounting anti-Catholic legislation, and built a reputation for pragmatic leadership that prioritized institutional survival above all else. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for the situation waiting at the Sisters of Divine Mercy Convent. He brought with him Father Thomas Brennan, a Jesuit known throughout the colonies for his skill in what the Church delicately called difficult interrogations. Father Brennan had a gift for extracting truth from people who preferred to keep secrets, a combination of psychological insight and relentless patience that wore down even the most determined resistance. If Sister Bridget was hiding something, Father Brennan would uncover it. The initial meeting took place in the convent's administrative office, with Sister Bridget seated across from the Archbishop, Father Callahan standing near the door, and Father Brennan taking notes at a small desk positioned to observe Sister Bridget's face clearly. The Archbishop began with deceptive gentleness, asking about her health, her duties, her years of service. Sister Bridget answered each question calmly, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. "The physicians tell me you're pregnant," the Archbishop said finally, abandoning pretense. 5 months along, a healthy pregnancy proceeding normally. "Sister Bridget, you're 55 years old. You've lived in religious community for 37 years. You took final vows of chastity before most of the women in this convent were born. How do you explain this?" "I explain it as God's direct intervention in my life," Sister Bridget said simply. "I prayed for a sign that my devotion mattered, that my years of service meant something beyond empty ritual. God answered by making the impossible possible. I am barren by every natural measure, yet I carry life within me. What other explanation exists except divine miracle? Father Brennan spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a quality that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Sister, miracles in church history follow certain patterns. They involve divine announcement. They serve clear theological purposes, and they're witnessed by multiple people. The Virgin Mary had the angel Gabriel. She had Joseph, Elizabeth, the shepherds, the wise men. Your claimed miracle has none of these elements. You experienced a private dream. You told no one until pregnancy was undeniable. You're asking us to accept that God chose to work in complete secrecy, leaving no witnesses, no corroboration, no theological clarity. Doesn't that strike you as unusual? The Blessed Virgin's pregnancy was also met with skepticism, Sister Bridget countered. Joseph planned to divorce her quietly. People assumed she'd been unfaithful. Only later, after Christ's ministry, did the miracle become widely accepted. Perhaps my situation follows the same pattern. Initial doubt followed by eventual recognition of divine purpose. The difference, Archbishop Cartwright said coldly, is that Mary was a young virgin betrothed to be married. You're a 55-year-old nun who took perpetual vows. The theological implications are entirely different. If God wanted to demonstrate his power, why choose a method that so closely resembles ordinary sin? Why not perform an unambiguous miracle that leaves no room for scandalous interpretation? Perhaps because unambiguous miracles require no faith, Sister Bridget said. Perhaps God is testing whether the Church can recognize his work even when it appears in unexpected forms. You want miracles that fit comfortably within established doctrine. But God isn't comfortable, Your Excellency. God is dangerous and unpredictable. He works through burning bushes, through floods that destroy the world, through his own Son's brutal execution. Why should his intervention in my life be any less disturbing? The Archbishop's face flushed red. You're not comparing yourself to Moses or Noah or Christ? I'm comparing my situation to every instance in Scripture where God acted in ways that challenged human understanding, Sister Bridget replied calmly. And I'm noting that in each case, religious authorities initially resisted, denied, and condemned before eventually being forced to acknowledge truth. Father Brennan set down his pen carefully. Sister Bridget, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. Has any man had sexual contact with you? Any man at all under any circumstances? No. Have you been alone with any man during the period when conception would have occurred? Sister Bridget hesitated for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but Father Brennan caught it. He leaned forward. Sister, that pause concerns me. Have you been alone with any man? I'm alone with Father Callahan during confession, Sister Bridget said. I'm occasionally alone with male merchants who deliver supplies. Samuel, who works in our library, is sometimes present when I'm working in adjacent rooms. But if you're asking whether any impropriety has occurred, the answer is absolutely not. Father Brennan made a note, underlining something twice. Tell me about Samuel. How long has he worked here? 2 years, since August 1762. And what are his duties? He manages the library, transcribes documents, assists with teaching basic literacy to younger students. He's educated, which makes him valuable for intellectual work. How educated? He can read, write, and perform mathematical calculations. His previous owner taught him these skills. And you're often in his presence? He works in the library. I sometimes work in the adjacent administrative office. We're separated by a doorway and considerable distance. If you're suggesting something improper, you're mistaken. Samuel is enslaved property. He follows instructions. There's nothing between us except the normal relationship between owner and worker. But Father Brennan had caught something in her voice when she said Samuel's name. A slight softening that hadn't been present before. He made another note and changed tactics. Sister, medical science tells us that pregnancy at your age, particularly after years of amenorrhea, is extraordinarily rare. Not impossible, but extremely unlikely. However, it does occasionally occur through natural means when conditions align properly. Are you certain there's no natural explanation for your pregnancy? I'm certain that 3 physicians confirmed my age, my medical history, and the biological improbability of conception, Sister Bridget said. And I'm certain that what's improbable by natural means becomes miraculous when it occurs anyway. Whether you call it rare natural occurrence or divine intervention depends entirely on your willingness to see God's hand in the world. The interrogation continued for 6 more hours. Father Brennan circling back repeatedly to questions about her daily routine, her interactions with men, her understanding of when conception occurred. Sister Bridget maintained absolute consistency, never contradicting herself, never showing uncertainty. But Father Brennan noted every small hesitation, every slight change in tone, building a map of potential vulnerabilities he could exploit later. When the session finally ended, the Archbishop ordered Sister Bridget confined to her cell under constant supervision. She would not be allowed to interact with anyone except the sister assigned to monitor her, and she would remain isolated until the investigation concluded. Sister Bridget accepted this restriction without protest, as though she'd expected it. After she left the room, the Archbishop turned to Father Brennan. "What do you think?" "She's hiding something," Father Brennan said immediately. "The story about divine intervention is genuine belief, I think. She truly believes God chose her for this purpose. But there's something else underneath. Something involving that enslaved man, Samuel. The way she said his name, the hesitation when I asked about being alone with men. She's constructed her miracle claim carefully, but she's left gaps in her defense. Then find those gaps," the Archbishop ordered. "Interview everyone in this convent. Examine every record. Reconstruct her movements over the past 6 months. Someone knows something they haven't told us, and I want that information before this scandal spreads beyond these walls." The systematic investigation began the next morning. Father Brennan interviewed every nun individually, asking detailed questions about Sister Bridget's behavior, her schedule, any unusual activities they'd noticed. Most sisters knew nothing helpful. They'd observed the same changes Sister Margaret had noted, the fuller face, the altered eating habits, the unusual fatigue, but attributed these to aging or illness. They certainly hadn't suspected pregnancy. Sister Anna, the young nun who managed laundry, provided the first significant clue. When Father Brennan asked about unusual patterns in Sister Bridget's behavior, Sister Anna mentioned something she'd initially thought insignificant. For several months during late spring and early summer, Sister Bridget had requested that her personal linens be left unwashed for 3-day periods, claiming she needed them for a special cleaning ritual involving particular herbs. Sister Anna had found this odd but hadn't questioned it. Mother Superiors didn't need to explain their requests. "How many times did she make this request?" Father Brennan asked. 4 times, I think. Maybe 5, between May and July. Always on 3-day intervals. "Yes, Father." "Every 3rd day she'd tell me to skip her linens for that specific night." Father Brennan added this to his notes. A pattern was emerging, though he couldn't yet see its full shape. He moved on to questioning the convent's lay workers, the people who maintained the physical property. An elderly gardener named James mentioned that Sister Bridget had taken an unusual interest in the old herb cellar during the spring. She'd asked him to ensure the cellar doors lock was properly functioning and had requested that he stay away from that section of the garden during certain evening hours when she was conducting private spiritual retreats. "Did you see her go down to the cellar?" Father Brennan asked. "Once or twice, Father, but I minded my own business. Wasn't my place to question what Mother Superior did with her time. Did you ever see anyone else near the cellar?" James hesitated, and Father Brennan recognized the look. This was a man deciding whether to betray information that might get someone else in trouble. "James, understand that withholding information in a church investigation is a grave sin. If you know something relevant, you must tell me. I saw Samuel near the cellar one night," James said finally. "Late, probably past midnight. I'd gotten up to check on a sick horse in the stable, and I saw him crossing the garden. Thought it was strange since he has no business in that section, but I figured maybe Mother Superior had sent him to retrieve something. Wasn't my place to ask. When was this? May, I think. Or early June. I don't remember exactly." Father Brennan felt pieces clicking into place. Sister Bridget requesting privacy at the old cellar. Samuel seen near the same location late at night. The 3-day pattern of linens being left unwashed, corresponding with the timing when conception attempts would be made. He needed to speak with Samuel directly, but he had to be careful. If Samuel had been coerced or threatened, he might deny everything out of fear. If he'd been a willing participant, he'd certainly deny involvement to save his own life. Father Brennan decided on an indirect approach. He requested that Father Callahan bring Samuel to the administrative office under the pretense of needing help organizing church documents. When Samuel arrived, Father Brennan studied him carefully. The young man was visibly nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he stood near the doorway, his eyes fixed on the floor. Samuel, I understand you work in the convent's library. Father Brennan began conversationally. How do you find the work? It's good work, Father. I'm grateful for the opportunity to use my education. And you've worked here for 2 years now? Yes, Father. Since August 1762, you must interact with Sister Bridget fairly regularly, given that her office is adjacent to the library. Samuel's throat worked as he swallowed. Sometimes, Father, when she needs documents or when I'm delivering correspondence. Have you noticed any changes in her behavior recently? Anything unusual? I don't observe Mother Superior's behavior, Father. That wouldn't be appropriate. Father Brennan let silence stretch out, a technique he'd perfected over years of interrogations. People felt compelled to fill silence, often revealing more than they intended. Samuel shifted his weight nervously, but said nothing, showing more self-control than Father Brennan had expected. Samuel, I'm going to be direct with you, Father Brennan said finally. Sister Bridget is pregnant. The physicians have confirmed it. This creates an impossible situation that requires explanation. Now, I don't believe in miracles that require secrecy and deception. I believe that when something impossible appears to occur, there's usually a very human explanation hiding underneath. Do you understand what I'm saying? Samuel's face had gone pale. Father, I don't know anything about Mother Superior's condition. I think you do. I think you know quite a lot. And Samuel, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your situation is precarious regardless of what you tell me. If Sister Bridget has sinned, someone will be blamed. The Church will find an explanation for this scandal, and that explanation will likely involve you whether you cooperate or not. Your best chance at survival is complete honesty right now. Tell me the truth and I'll do everything in my power to protect you. Continue lying and I can't help you. Samuel stood frozen, terror and calculation warring across his face. He was an intelligent young man, educated enough to understand the trap he was in. If he confessed involvement, he'd be admitting to something that could get him killed. If he continued denying knowledge and the truth emerged anyway, he'd lose whatever protection honesty might provide. Father, Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper, if I tell you what happened, will you promise that I'll be protected? That I won't be handed over to men who'll kill me without asking questions? Father Brennan felt a wave of satisfaction mixed with pity. I promise that I'll recommend the Church take custody of you and transport you somewhere safe. That's the best assurance I can offer. Samuel closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had broken behind them. It was her idea, all of it. She approached me with this plan, showed me medical texts about artificial breeding methods, promised me freedom if I helped her prove that God could work miracles through scientific means. I said no at first. I swear I said no, but she kept pushing and she had all the power and I was desperate and she promised. His voice broke and for a moment he couldn't continue. Father Brennan waited, his expression carefully neutral, as Samuel gathered himself. We never touched each other, Samuel continued. She made that very clear. It was all done separately, using glass vessels and medical instruments in that old herb cellar where no one would see. She calculated everything perfectly, followed procedures from the French medical books she'd studied. 4 times we did it, spread over 3-day intervals. Then she told me to wait, to say nothing, to pretend it never happened. And I waited, hoping maybe it wouldn't work, hoping maybe the whole thing would just go away. But it didn't go away, did it? She's actually pregnant, and now everyone's going to think I forced myself on a nun. And they're going to kill me for something she orchestrated. Father Brennan had heard countless confessions in his career, but this one left him genuinely shaken. The calculated nature of Sister Bridget's plan, the manipulation of a powerless young man, the twisted fusion of scientific knowledge and religious delusion, it was more disturbing than simple adultery would have been. This wasn't passion or weakness. This was cold, deliberate engineering of circumstances designed to manufacture a miracle. Samuel, did Sister Bridget promise you freedom? Did she show you documents? She promised, but she didn't show me anything official. She said that after the miracle was confirmed, she'd have authority to grant manumission. That the Church would give her whatever she wanted because denying her would mean denying God's work. I wanted to believe her because what else did I have? But I knew somewhere deep down, I knew it was a lie. People like me don't get freedom. We get used and discarded. Father Brennan made careful notes of everything Samuel said, recording details that would form the foundation of the Church's official response. When he finished, he looked at the young man with something approaching sympathy. Samuel, you'll be confined to a secure location until the Archbishop decides how to proceed. I know that's not the reassurance you want, but it's better than the alternative. If we let you remain visible, there are men in Baltimore who'll take justice into their own hands. The church's custody is your only protection." Samuel nodded numbly, understanding that protection in this context meant imprisonment of a different kind. Father Brennan summoned 2 trusted laymen to escort Samuel to a locked storage room in the convent's cellar. Not the herb cellar where the procedures had occurred, but a different, more secure space. They would guard him there until the Archbishop made final decisions about his fate. The confrontation with Sister Bridget occurred that evening. The Archbishop, Father Brennan, and Father Callahan entered her cell where she'd been confined since the initial interrogation. She sat on her narrow bed, hands folded over her swollen abdomen, looking almost peaceful despite the circumstances. "We've spoken with Samuel," the Archbishop said without preamble. "He's told us everything. The herb cellar, the procedures, the French medical texts, your promises of freedom, all of it." Sister Bridget's expression didn't change. "Then you know the truth. I used knowledge God gave humanity to achieve what appeared miraculous. A barren woman conceiving through devotion and determination. How is that different from any other miracle involving human participation? It's different because you manipulated an enslaved man with false promises," Father Callahan said, his voice shaking with anger. "You put his life at risk for your theological experiment. You showed him forged documents, led him to believe you could grant freedom you had no authority to give. That's not faith, Sister Bridget. That's cruelty dressed in religious language." "I never showed him forged documents," Sister Bridget protested. "I showed him my intention written clearly. I told him I would do everything possible to secure his freedom. I never claimed to have existing authority. I told him I would gain that authority through the miracle itself." "Semantics," the Archbishop spat. "You knew he was desperate. You knew he'd grasp at any hope, no matter how false. You exploited his powerlessness to serve your own need to feel specially chosen by God. That's not divine purpose, Sister Bridget. That's pride. The worst kind of pride, because you've dressed it in the language of humility." Sister Bridget's serene expression finally cracked. "I've served God for 37 years. I've denied myself everything. I've fasted until my body weakened. I've prayed until my knees bled. I've done everything the church demanded and received nothing in return except more demands. When I finally asked for one sign, one confirmation that my devotion mattered, when I finally took action to demonstrate that faith and knowledge could coexist, you call it pride. You call it cruelty? What would you call it if I'd remained passive, waiting for a miracle that never comes, wasting my entire life on empty ritual?" "I would call it faithfulness," the Archbishop said coldly. "Real faith doesn't demand proof. Real faith doesn't manipulate others to manufacture signs. Real faith accepts that we may never receive confirmation in this life. You've confused faith with certainty, Sister Bridget, and in doing so, you've committed sins far worse than simple adultery would have been." The trial, if it could be called that, convened on October 15th in the convent's chapel, hastily converted into an ecclesiastical court. Present were the Archbishop, Father Brennan, Father Callahan, 3 additional priests brought from Philadelphia, and a recorder who documented everything for the official church archives. Sister Bridget stood before them, no longer wearing her habit, but dressed in a simple gray dress that emphasized her obvious pregnancy. The evidence was presented systematically. Samuel's detailed confession, corroborated by the gardener's testimony about the herb cellar, Sister Anna's information about the laundry schedule, the French medical texts found in Sister Bridget's cell, the glass vessels and syringes discovered in the sealed cellar. Father Brennan had been thorough, building a case that left no room for alternative interpretation. Sister Bridget was given opportunity to defend herself. She spoke for nearly 2 hours, presenting theological arguments about the relationship between faith and knowledge, citing historical examples of saints who'd used unconventional methods to serve God, quoting scripture passages about God's power exceeding human understanding. Her arguments were sophisticated, carefully constructed, passionately delivered. Under different circumstances, they might have made interesting theological debate. But the Archbishop had no interest in debate. He'd come to contain a scandal that threatened the Catholic Church's already precarious position in Maryland. Every day this situation remained unresolved. Protestant ministers throughout the colonies were preaching sermons about Catholic corruption, using the scandal as evidence that Rome's influence bred moral decay. The verdict came swiftly. Sister Bridget O'Malley was guilty of deception, manipulation, and perversion of theological doctrine. She would be immediately defrocked, stripped of all religious authority, and exiled from Maryland. The child she carried would be taken at birth and placed with a Catholic family far from Baltimore, raised with no knowledge of its origin. Sister Bridget herself would be confined to a cloistered monastery in New France, where she would live out her days in absolute silence, forbidden from speaking of these events to anyone. Samuel posed a more complex problem. He'd been coerced, that much was clear, but his participation in the scheme still made him dangerous. Angry citizens were already gathering outside the convent, demanding that the enslaved man who'd defiled a bride of Christ face proper punishment. The Archbishop understood that turning Samuel over to mob justice would create additional scandal, but keeping him in Maryland guaranteed his eventual murder. The solution came from an unexpected source. A merchant ship captain named Robert Harrison, himself a Catholic sympathetic to the church's predicament, offered to transport Samuel to Nova Scotia under the pretense of him being indentured cargo. Once in Halifax, Harrison had contacts who could help Samuel disappear into the frontier territories where questions about legal status went unasked. It wasn't freedom, not officially, but it was survival. Samuel departed Baltimore on October 19th, shackled in the ship's hold to maintain the appearance of proper custody, but secretly provided with clean clothing, adequate food, and a letter of introduction to Harrison's contact in Halifax. Whether he actually reached Nova Scotia, whether he survived the journey or managed to build a new life in the wilderness, the records don't say. Like so many people caught in historical events beyond their control, Samuel simply vanished from documented history. Sister Bridget's exile was delayed by one practical consideration. She was 6 months pregnant, and travel to New France in her condition risked both her life and the child's. The church couldn't afford to have her die in transit. That would create a martyr and fuel speculation that the pregnancy had indeed been miraculous. She needed to deliver safely. The child needed to be placed quietly, and only then could she be shipped away to perpetual silence. They confined her to a private house in Baltimore's outskirts, a property owned by a Catholic widow who agreed to house Sister Bridget in exchange for the church paying off her substantial debts. 2 nuns, Sister Margaret and Sister Catherine, volunteered to attend her during the final months of pregnancy. Both women had known Sister Bridget for years, and despite everything, they couldn't bring themselves to abandon her completely. Those months of confinement broke Sister Bridget in ways the trial and exile sentence hadn't. Stripped of authority, separated from the convent she'd led for a decade, facing a future of absolute silence in a distant monastery, she finally confronted the magnitude of what she'd done. The journals she kept during this period, discovered decades later and now held in private archives, reveal a woman grappling with guilt, doubt, and the terrible possibility that she'd mistaken pride for divine calling. One entry, dated December 3rd, reads, "I believed God spoke to me in dreams. I was so certain, so absolutely convinced that I'd been chosen for special purpose. But now, carrying this child I'll never raise, having destroyed Samuel's life and my own in pursuit of certainty, I wonder if what I heard was only my own desperate need for significance echoing back at me. Did God call me to this? Or did I manufacture a calling because I couldn't bear to think that 37 years of devotion might mean nothing more than any other person's devotion? That I might be ordinary rather than chosen?" The birth approached, and with it, the final chapter of a scandal that had consumed lives and exposed the dangerous spaces between faith and obsession, between miracle and manipulation, between divine purpose and human desperation. The labor began on February 14, 1765, 3 days before the date Dr. William Harrison had predicted. Sister Bridget had spent the morning in restless pacing, her hands pressed against the small of her back, trying to ease the constant ache that had plagued her for weeks. When the first contraction struck at noon, sharp and unmistakable, she didn't cry out. She simply lowered herself onto the bed and called for Sister Margaret with a voice that carried more resignation than fear. Dr. Harrison arrived within the hour. Accompanied by 2 experienced midwives the church had hired specifically for this purpose. Catherine Moore and Elizabeth Garrett had delivered hundreds of babies in Baltimore, and both had been paid extraordinary sums to ensure their absolute discretion. They would witness the birth, assist with delivery, and then never speak of it again. The Church had made very clear what would happen to women who broke such agreements. The labor progressed slowly, as first births often did, but with unusual complications. Sister Bridget was 55 years old, and her body, despite the pregnancy's surprising health throughout gestation, struggled with the physical demands of delivery. By evening, she'd been in active labor for 6 hours, and Dr. Harrison's concern was mounting. The baby's position seemed correct, but Sister Bridget's exhaustion was becoming dangerous. She'd stopped eating days earlier, consumed by anxiety about the approaching separation from the child, and her weakened state made every contraction less effective than it should have been. "You need to push harder," Dr. Harrison told her repeatedly. "I know you're tired, but the baby won't deliver itself. You have to give me everything you have left." Sister Bridget tried, her face flushed and streaming with sweat, her hands gripping the bed frame so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sister Margaret stood on one side, Sister Catherine on the other, both women supporting her through each wave of pain. The midwives worked efficiently, checking progress, offering water, changing soaked linens. Hours passed with agonizing slowness, the room growing darker as candles burned down and had to be replaced. Around midnight, Dr. Harrison made a decision. "We need to use forceps. The labor has stalled, and waiting longer risks both lives. Sister Bridget, do you understand? This will hurt considerably, but it may be our only option." Sister Bridget nodded weakly, beyond speech, beyond anything except endurance. Dr. Harrison retrieved the metal instruments from his bag, explaining to the midwives how they would need to support Sister Bridget's position while he worked. The forceps procedure in 1765 was brutal and dangerous, responsible for countless injuries and deaths, but sometimes it was the only alternative to watching both mother and child die slowly. What followed tested everyone's fortitude. Sister Bridget screamed, a sound that echoed through the house and out into the winter night where neighbors heard and crossed themselves, grateful they didn't know what was happening behind those walls. Dr. Harrison worked with careful precision, maneuvering the forceps into position, feeling for the baby's head, applying traction with gradual, steady pressure. Catherine Moore held Sister Bridget's hand while Elizabeth Garrett monitored for hemorrhaging, both women whispering prayers under their breath. At 1:47 in the morning on February 15, 1765, the baby emerged in a rush of blood and fluid. Dr. Harrison caught the infant, quickly cleared the airway, and felt relief flood through him when he heard a strong, healthy cry. He handed the baby to Catherine Moore, who cleaned and wrapped the child while Dr. Harrison delivered the placenta and checked Sister Bridget for tearing. The damage was significant, requiring extensive stitching, but nothing that threatened her life. "It's a boy," Catherine announced, bringing the wrapped infant to Sister Bridget. "Healthy lungs, good color, all fingers and toes present." Sister Bridget looked at her son with an expression that Dr. Harrison would later describe in his private notes as absolutely heartbreaking. Not joy, not relief, not even the exhausted satisfaction most new mothers showed. Just profound grief mixed with something like wonder. She touched the baby's face with trembling fingers, traced his tiny nose, examined his perfect features in the candlelight. "He looks like Samuel," she whispered. "His eyes, his mouth. He looks just like Samuel." Sister Margaret tensed, glancing at Dr. Harrison with alarm. They'd been instructed to prevent Sister Bridget from forming any attachment, to keep the baby separate, to facilitate the quick transfer to the adoptive family. But Dr. Harrison, who'd seen many births and understood something about human nature that church officials often didn't, made a choice that probably saved Sister Bridget's sanity. "Give her 30 minutes, he said quietly. 30 minutes to hold him. Denying her that completely will cause psychological damage that could prove dangerous. 30 minutes won't change what happens next, but it might prevent complete breakdown." Sister Catherine lifted the infant and placed him in Sister Bridget's arms. The moment the baby settled against her chest, Sister Bridget began to weep, silent tears that streamed down her face and dropped onto the blanket wrapped around her son. She didn't sob, didn't wail, just cried steadily while holding him close, breathing in his scent, memorizing every detail she could. "I thought I was doing God's will," she said softly, speaking more to the baby than to anyone else in the room. "I thought I'd been chosen for something meaningful, something that would prove faith and knowledge could coexist. But I was wrong. I was so desperately wrong. I used another human being as a tool. I put Samuel in terrible danger because I needed to feel special, needed to believe I mattered more than other people. And now you exist because of my pride. And you'll never know me, and Samuel will never know you, and all three of us will pay forever for my need to manufacture a miracle." She kissed the baby's forehead once, gently, then looked at Sister Margaret. Take him now, before I become even more selfish and refuse to let go. He deserves better than being used as evidence in my failed theological argument." Sister Margaret lifted the infant from Sister Bridget's arms, and the moment of separation seemed to break something fundamental in the older woman. She turned her face to the wall and didn't speak again for 2 full days, even when Dr. Harrison returned to check on her recovery, even when the nuns tried to coax her into eating, even when Father Callahan came to administer last rites, thinking she might be dying from psychological collapse rather than physical complications. The adoptive family arrived on February 17th. Marcus and Helen Whitfield were a prosperous couple from Virginia, Catholic, childless after 15 years of marriage, and desperate enough for a baby that they'd agreed to the church's conditions without hesitation. They would raise the boy as their own son, tell everyone he'd been born to Helen after years of prayer and medical treatment, and never reveal the truth. In exchange, the church would provide financial support, excellent education for the child, and connections that would ensure his future success. They named him James, baptized him on February 20th at their parish church in Richmond, and raised him with love and considerable privilege. James Whitfield would grow up completely ignorant of his origins, attend college, become a successful lawyer, marry, and father 5 children who would never know that their grandfather had been an enslaved man and their grandmother a defrocked nun who'd tried to manufacture a miracle. The secret would die with Marcus and Helen, buried so thoroughly that even family historians researching their genealogy centuries later would find no trace of the scandal. Sister Bridget recovered physically within 3 weeks, though the emotional wounds never healed. The church kept its promise about exile, arranging her transport to the monastery of the Sacred Heart in Quebec on March 15th. The journey took 23 days, traveling by coach to New York and then by ship up the coast to the St. Lawrence River. Sister Margaret accompanied her, having volunteered to escort the woman she'd known for nearly 2 decades to her final destination. Sister Margaret's letters to Father Callahan, preserved in the Baltimore Diocesan Archives, describe Sister Bridget during this journey as someone already dead in every meaningful sense. She moves when directed, eats when food is placed before her, but there's nothing behind her eyes anymore. The woman who led our convent with such fierce conviction has been hollowed out completely. I don't know if the monastery's silence will be punishment or mercy. She has nothing left to say anyway. The monastery of the Sacred Heart occupied a remote location 30 miles from Quebec City, accessible only by difficult roads that became impassable during winter months. 27 nuns lived there in perpetual silence, following rules established in the 13th century by an order dedicated to contemplative prayer. They never spoke to each other, never left the monastery grounds, spent their days in prayer, work, and meditation. It was considered one of the strictest religious communities in New France, a place where women went to disappear from the world entirely. Sister Bridget entered the monastery on April 7th, 1765. Sister Margaret stayed for 3 days, ensuring the transition was complete, then departed for Baltimore without having spoken a single word to Sister Bridget after their arrival. The monastery's rules forbade communication even during the introduction period. Sister Bridget simply walked through the gates, received her cell assignment, and vanished into the rhythm of silent devotion that would define the rest of her existence. The historical record provides almost nothing about her years in Quebec. The monastery's records list her as Sister Mary Silence, a new name given to erase her previous identity, and note her presence in daily routines but offer no personal details. One document, a brief entry in the Mother Superior's private journal, dated September 1767, mentions that Sister Mary Silence spent long hours in the chapel weeping silently, and that on several occasions she had to be physically restrained from harming herself. Beyond that, nothing. She existed in complete obscurity for the remaining years of her life. The monastery burned in October 1775 during the American invasion of Quebec. British and American forces clashed in the region, and the monastery, suspected of harboring supplies for British troops, was set ablaze by soldiers who didn't bother checking whether anyone was inside. 15 nuns died in the fire, trapped by locked doors and windows barred to prevent worldly distraction. Among the dead was Sister Mary Silence, who'd lived in absolute silence for 10 years and died the same way. Her screams unheard behind stone walls consumed by flames. Back in Baltimore, the Catholic Church worked methodically to erase every trace of the scandal. The house where Sister Bridget had given birth was sold immediately. The new owners told nothing about its previous use. The Sisters of Divine Mercy convent struggled for several years, enrollment dropping catastrophically as Catholic families withdrew their daughters and Protestant neighbors used the scandal as ammunition against the Church. By 1770, only 7 nuns remained, and the Archbishop made the decision to close the facility permanently. The building was sold to a shipping merchant who converted it into warehouses, and within a decade, most people in Baltimore had forgotten there'd ever been a convent on that property. Father Callahan, whose confession journal had documented the scandal's discovery, lived until 1782. In his final years, he returned repeatedly to that November 1764 entry, adding marginal notes that revealed his continuing struggle to understand what had happened. One note, written in shaking handwriting just months before his death, reads, "I've spent 18 years trying to determine whether Sister Bridget was delusional, manipulative, or somehow genuinely touched by something beyond human understanding. I die without knowing." Perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. Perhaps we're not meant to fully understand the space where faith becomes obsession, where devotion becomes destruction. I only know that good intentions and absolute certainty together created something monstrous. Samuel's fate remained unknown to everyone in Baltimore. The Church had shipped him away so thoroughly that no one knew whether he'd survived the journey to Nova Scotia or what had become of him afterward. There were occasional rumors. A free black man matching his description reportedly worked as a clerk in Halifax in the 1770s. Someone claimed to have seen him in Montreal in 1779. Another story placed him in the frontier, territories west of the Great Lakes, living among indigenous communities who cared nothing about colonial laws regarding slavery. But none of these stories could be verified, and eventually people stopped wondering. Samuel had been erased as completely as Sister Bridget, both of them casualties of a scandal that required absolute silence to contain. James Whitfield, the child born from Sister Bridget's theological experiment, lived a long and prosperous life completely ignorant of his origin. He practiced law in Richmond, served in the Virginia legislature, owned a plantation worked by enslaved people who never knew that their master's biological father had been enslaved himself. He died in 1836 at age 71, surrounded by children and grandchildren who mourned him as a pillar of their community. His obituary in the Richmond Enquirer praised his legal brilliance, his devotion to family, and his strong moral character. Nothing in his life suggested the extraordinary circumstances of his conception and birth. But there are hints, small traces in family correspondence, that James occasionally felt something unexplainable. His daughter Ellen wrote in her diary in 1828 about a conversation with her father, where he mentioned having dreams about a woman's face he couldn't quite remember. Someone who seemed familiar but whom he'd never met in waking life. "Father said the strangest thing today," Ellen wrote. "He said he sometimes feels as though part of his life happened to someone else, as though he's living a story that began before he was born. Mother told him not to speak such nonsense, but I could see in his eyes that it troubles him more than he admits." Whether James was actually experiencing some deep, unconscious memory of those first hours in Sister Bridget's arms, or whether this was simply the kind of existential wondering that affects many people, we can never know. But the possibility remains that even though the Church had erased all documentary evidence, even though everyone involved had died or been silenced, some shadow of truth persisted in ways that couldn't be completely controlled. The documents that survived, scattered across church archives from Baltimore to Quebec to Philadelphia, weren't discovered until the late 19th century. A young priest researching Baltimore's Catholic history for a church anniversary publication found Father Callahan's journal in 1893 and immediately recognized its significance. He brought it to his bishop's attention, expecting praise for uncovering important historical material. Instead, he was ordered to reseal the documents and never mention them again. The Church had successfully buried the scandal for 130 years and had no intention of resurrecting it. But stories have a way of refusing to stay buried. Over the decades, fragments leaked out. Historians researching colonial Maryland occasionally found references to a convent scandal in Protestant newspapers from 1764 and 1765, though details were vague. Genealogists tracing Catholic families sometimes encountered gaps in records that suggested deliberate erasure. And slowly, painfully slowly, the full story emerged from archives that church officials had assumed would remain sealed forever. What we're left with is a story that defies simple moral judgment. Sister Bridget O'Malley wasn't a villain in any conventional sense. She was a woman who'd devoted her entire life to faith, who'd sacrificed every comfort and pleasure in pursuit of divine purpose, and who'd finally cracked under the weight of that devotion. She wanted proof that her suffering meant something, that her decades of discipline had earned God's attention. She wanted to believe she'd been chosen for special purpose rather than being just another forgotten nun in a forgotten convent. And in pursuit of that need for significance, she manipulated a powerless young man, put his life at risk, and birthed a child who would never know either parent. Samuel wasn't a villain either. He was trapped in a system that treated human beings as property, given a glimpse of possible freedom, and exploited by someone who held absolute power over him. His participation in Sister Bridget's scheme was coerced through a combination of false promises and the crushing reality that refusing might lead to even worse circumstances. He survived, possibly, but at the cost of everything familiar. His homeland, his small community, whatever fragile stability he'd managed to build. He vanished into history like so many enslaved people whose stories were never recorded, whose lives were never considered important enough to preserve. And James, the child at the center of everything, lived his entire life as a lie. Not through any fault of his own, but because powerful institutions decided that truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. He grew up privileged and respected, never knowing that his existence had destroyed multiple lives, never understanding that he was evidence of how far people will go when absolute faith collides with desperate pride. The Catholic Church, for its part, demonstrated institutional priorities that remain uncomfortably familiar. Faced with a scandal that threatened its reputation, it chose containment over transparency, exile over accountability, silence over truth. Everyone involved was either killed, shipped away, or sworn to secrecy. Documents were sealed, buildings were sold, memories were deliberately erased. And for 130 years the strategy worked perfectly. But here we are, more than 250 years later, and we're talking about it. The sealed room exists to bring you exactly these kinds of buried stories. The historical events that powerful institutions tried to erase because they reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the abuse of power, about what happens when faith becomes untethered from compassion. Sister Bridget's story reminds us that the most dangerous people often aren't those who lack faith, but rather those whose faith is so absolute that it justifies any action. That certainty about divine purpose can excuse manipulation, coercion, and the destruction of other people's lives. It reminds us that enslaved people like Samuel existed not as historical abstractions, but as real human beings with hopes, fears, and impossible choices forced upon them by systems designed to crush their humanity. Samuel's education, his intelligence, his ability to read and write, none of it protected him from being used and discarded when convenient. His voice was silenced so thoroughly that we don't even know if he survived past 1765, let alone whether he ever found any measure of peace or freedom. And it reminds us that children born from scandal, manipulation, and institutional cover-ups grow up as real people who never asked to be evidence in anyone's theological argument or bargaining chips in anyone's negotiation with God. James Whitfield lived 71 years without knowing the truth. But that doesn't mean the truth didn't shape his life in invisible ways. The absence of information is itself a form of information, a gap that manifests as unexplained dreams, as strange feelings of disconnection, as questions that can't quite be articulated. So what do we take from this story? What do we learn from a 55-year-old nun who tried to manufacture a miracle, an 18-year-old enslaved man who was offered false hope, and a child who lived a lie for 7 decades? Maybe we learn that faith becomes dangerous when it prioritizes divine approval over human compassion. That theological certainty can justify terrible actions when it's divorced from ethical responsibility toward other people. That institutional self-preservation consistently trumps individual justice when those institutions face existential threats to their authority and reputation. Maybe we learn that the most complete erasures are never actually complete. That stories persist in fragments, in marginal notes, in unsealed archives, in the dreams of descendants who feel shadows they can't explain. That truth has weight and presence even when buried under centuries of deliberate silence. Or maybe we learn something simpler and more immediate. That every historical scandal, every buried story, every sealed archive contains real people whose lives mattered, whose suffering wasn't justified by anyone's grand purpose, whose voices deserve to be heard even centuries after they were forcibly silenced. Sister Bridget O'Malley died in flames in 1775. Her screams unheard, her name erased, her story successfully buried for generations. Samuel disappeared into historical obscurity, another enslaved person whose fate was considered too insignificant to document. James Whitfield died respected and mourned, never knowing the truth about his origins. And the Catholic Church moved forward, secure in the knowledge that its containment strategy had worked perfectly. But the story survived anyway, hidden in scattered documents, waiting for someone to piece together the fragments. And now you know what happened behind those convent walls in 1764. The scandal the Church spent 130 years trying to erase. The impossible pregnancy that destroyed everyone it touched. History's darkest stories aren't always about battles or political intrigue. Sometimes they're about ordinary people pushed to extraordinary actions by faith, by desperation, by the terrible space between miracle and manipulation. Sometimes they're about institutions choosing silence over truth because acknowledging complexity is more dangerous than enforcing simple narratives. And sometimes they're about us, right now, confronting the uncomfortable reality that the forces that destroyed Sister Bridget, Samuel and James haven't disappeared. They've just found new forms, new expressions, new ways to prioritize institutional survival over individual humanity. What happened in Baltimore in 1764 matters not because it was unique, but because it was typical. Typical of how power operates, how institutions protect themselves, how desperate people make terrible choices when trapped in impossible situations. The specifics may be extreme, a nun attempting artificial insemination to prove God's power, but the underlying dynamics, manipulation, coercion, cover-up, erasure, those dynamics remain depressingly familiar. So remember Sister Bridget, not as a villain or a victim, but as a warning. Remember Samuel, not as a name in a scandal, but as a human being whose life was destroyed by someone else's theological vanity. Remember James, living a lie he never chose. And remember that the only reason we can tell this story at all is because complete erasure, no matter how thorough, eventually fails. Truth seeps through the cracks in even the most carefully sealed rooms.